Today, we're talking about one of the best ways to make your clothes look clean, polished, and last longer, and that's seam finishes. If you've ever washed a handmade garment or just a big piece of fabric and saw all of the edges or seams unraveling, this video is for you. We want to make the inside of our garment just as beautiful as the outside. It's really important to finish your seams because it eliminates any fraying from happening during wear or washing. It also makes everything look tidy and beautiful inside, which is quite important to me also. It makes your clothes last longer, and in some instances, it actually strengthens the seam or allows for stretching. And it's also to pick the right seam finish, and there's no one size fits all. There's a few things you need to consider, like the type of fabric you have. Is it heavyweight or lightweight, or is it stretchy? How much fray you have in your fabric. Some fabrics won't fray at all, like I'm wearing a ponte right now, and it really doesn't fray. It gets a little ratty at the edges, but fraying is not a big issue. And then I'm going to show you some fabric very soon that you'll see I just washed it, pre-washed it for the first time when I got it home, and it's already fraying all over the place. So that one I'm going to have to be very careful how I finish those seams. And we also want to consider the type of garment. Is just a casual tee that we just want some quick, finish on the inside, or is it a very fancy garment or something that we will see the inside of the garment? So then we might want to choose a different seam in those instances. And then lastly, we just consider the tools and the time you have. So do you have a serger? Then you probably want to go to that a lot. Or how much time do you just want a really clean finish? And maybe you're going to choose something that's really fast. So when should you finish your seams? Typically, I finish my seam immediately after I sew the seam, or sometimes it's right before. So there's certain instances that I will finish the edge with either a zigzag, a pinking, or a serger, and then you sew it together. Or I'll sew the seam together, and then I will serge the seam, the two seam pieces I'll sew together to make a nice clean edge. But there's some instances where you actually are sewing and finishing the seam all in one, like the flat felled seam or the French seam. You're finishing it as you're sewing it. If you're not sure when to finish what, I've created an order of construction guide that walks you through the entire process of constructing your garment, including when to do your seams. You can get the link in the description below.
It's extremely important to finish our seam because if we don't, we get all this fraying. This piece of fabric, it's a little cotton, I just threw into the washing machine when I got it home, and you can see all the fraying that has already happened just from washing it once. So our seams would become a mess on many fabrics. Some fabrics don't fray, but some fray a lot. So it's really important to finish our seams, not only for the fraying, but also to make the inside of the garment look really nice. Here's all of the seam finishes that I'm going to show you: pinking, zigzagging, serger, both seams together, serger with your seam pressed open, a French seam, a flat felled seam, and a Hong Kong finish. So it goes from probably easier to harder, and they're all quite lovely though, and any of them will make a nice finish for the inside of your garment. Probably the easiest way to finish our seams is just to use pinking shears. They're very inexpensive. I just sewed the seam and then just pinked the edges and then pressed the seam open. Depending on the type of fabric you have, you could get some fraying here as well. You get a lot less. It's definitely a good option if you don't want to do some of these other methods. But if we're sewing, we probably have a sewing machine. So I would recommend, rather than pinking, to zigzag the edge, which is I did here. When I zigzag, I always make sure I go slightly off to the side, and it does a good job of preventing fraying. I do have a few little things here that was just before I zigzagged. I would probably just trim those off. But I think it looks very neat, and then I zigzag them and press them to the side. Now you can press them open too. Let me bring in here my favorite method is serging. So you can see I serge both of my seams together here and pressed them to the side, just like I zigzagged and pressed them to the side. But you can zigzag or serge each of the edges and then press it open. So you do not need to zigzag and or serge them together. That is one way you can do it as well. But my favorite method is serging. Um, I use these probably interchangeably. Sometimes I want to press the seam open because I may have another seam that's crossing here, and I don't want to have too much bulk when you press them to the side. All of these, layers are all on one side, and it can get bulky there. So I do use them interchangeably. I think they both look equally nice. If I didn't have an issue with a cross seam, I probably would do this one. I do think it just looks slightly neater, just having just one serged edge rather than two. And this is another one of my favorites. I don't use it that often just because it does take one extra step, but I think it's quite lovely. The French seam, everything is completely encased. That's the front side, and this is the back side. It's just quite lovely. I would use this if I had a material that was see-through and I absolutely did not want to see the seam from the right side, because then if you do see this, it's just quite lovely. Or if you have something that you're really going to see the inside a lot, like a jacket or something, it would be really quite nice to finish it this way. And a flat felt seam, I don't use them that much. Typically you see these on jeans or those kind of more sporty things, which I typically don't like. It is interchangeable. This is typically the inside, that's the outside, but I think you could do, depending on which look you like, you could do either. It's a very, very sturdy seam. There's nothing to catch. It looks equally beautiful on the inside or the outside because it's almost like it's interchangeable. So if you do have an interchangeable garment, this might be a really great seam to use. Definitely great to have it in your repertoire. Then we have the Hong Kong seam finish, which is quite beautiful. It's great if you are going to see the inside of your garment. Perhaps it's a jacket that might open up, and it's nice if you want a bordering different color on it. I tend to not like this though. It is a lot of work to do, and I just think it's slightly bulky because you have all these different layers. Basically, it's 3 layers of fabric there. So I don't typically reach for this, but I perhaps would if I knew that you could possibly see the inside of my jacket or something like that. It would definitely be nice to use. I sewed along the seam here 1/4 of an inch. If you want, you can even do it less because we're going to trim some off. So you could do 1/8 of an inch. It's sometimes a little hard to get it nice and precise at 1/8. So I'll do 1/4 and then I'll trim it just to make it very nice and neat. So we have very little seam, about 1/8 of an inch there. Just got back from the ironing board. What I first did with this piece is I pressed it to the side here. As you can see, I pressed it to one side. It doesn't matter which side. Then I folded it over and I made sure that the seam was right there on the edge. And then I pressed it again. So I will make it a lot easier when I want to stitch along here. So we're going to stitch another 1/4 inch or however wide you want. You have to calculate how much seam allowance you need. Our first seam we did at 1/4 inch. This next seam I'm going to do at another 1/4 of an inch. So that would be a total of a 1/2 inch seam I would need to create in order to make sure that I didn't go into the actual garment width. But that's up to you, how wide you want your seams ultimately to be. I think a 1/4 inch will look good. If you want something really small, you could also just do 1/8 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch, and then you'd only need a total of a 1/4 inch built into your seam allowance. So I sewed along a 1/4 of an inch here. Then I'm going to open up the seam, and this is our right side. So when you first put together the seam, you need to make sure that you start with wrong sides together, which is not what we normally do. Normally we start with right sides together because we put wrong sides together to start, then we flip it back out, and here we are with right sides at this point. So I'm going to go and press this so we get a nice seam, and you'll see how beautifully it's finished. Here we have the finished seam. It's beautiful on the outside. On the inside, it's equally as beautiful. So you're just going to press this over to one side, and I just love this finish. It's particularly good with sheer fabrics, so your inside looks as nice as your outside, and you don't see those raw seams if it is a bit sheer, through the outside. Next, we're going to do the flat felled seam. So I made a seam 5/8 of an inch. Typically, I like to do a 1/2 an inch, but for this one, it's better to start at 5/8 of an inch to give yourself a little extra room. What I did then is cut back one side of the seam to about half the distance. I went a little bit more than half because I want to make sure that I have enough room. And then what we're going to do is fold this over like this the whole way down and press that. It's important to decide ultimately how you want to fold your seam. So I had decided I wanted to fold my seam this direction. So when I fold this over, it'll go that way. So think about that ahead of time before you decide which of these sides you're going to trim down. So I'm going to go to the ironing board now and press this all. I pressed it all down. You can see on the other side here, the part that I folded over. First, I went to the ironing board and I just pressed it like this. Then I opened it up and pressed it down. And you can see how nice and neat that looks. The raw edge is all encased inside. And now I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and just stitch along this outer side, and we'll get a nice look to the finish. And there we go. I stitched along here very carefully because you have to use a lot of precision. I stitched from the wrong side. This is the wrong side of the fabric. You'll see this was my original stitch line. And then the right side looks like this. Now, if you like this look, which is sort of nice, a lot of times you'll see this in jeans and so forth. So you could do wrong sides together to start, and then this could be your outer look if you want. So what I did, if you put right sides together, which is typical of how you start sewing together two pieces, this is what you'll get with just one line here, and the other one is the seam line. So you can just decide which one you like. It's very durable, and it's really a great seam finish to have in your repertoire. Onto the Hong Kong finish, I will have a 1/2 inch seam allowance here that I pressed open, and 2 bias strips. And these are about an inch and a quarter. Having it slightly wider is helpful, but we may have to trim down afterwards. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this bias strip and pin it onto here, onto the, let's call it the right side of the seam allowance, the side that would be facing towards you on the inside of the garment. So I'm going to pin that, and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch along this side, which is half the seam allowance. So you can see that's how it's going to be. It's about a 1/4 inch in. I'm going to do the same thing with this one, pin this one down to this side, then I'll be back and show you where I'm at. So I sewed each of the bias strips onto the seam allowance. You can see here, I sewed them each at a 1/4 inch there, about halfway to the seam. And then I went to the ironing board and folded this over. Now you can see I have a little bit extra because I cut mine about 1.25 inches. So just to give yourself a little extra room. So I'm going to trim that back a little bit because we don't want that to go past this seam line. So I'm going to give that just like a slight trim. So if you just made yours a little bit less wide, it would be fine. So you can see once I trim that, and it's going to look beautiful. Then I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch in the ditch right along that seam here, and you can see it'll catch it over here, so it'll be beautifully finished. I pinned down where I'm going to sew, so I'm going to sew right here in the seam line the whole way up, and you can see when I do this, where this pin is, it will capture this down on the other side. So you see the pins are there, and that's where the seam line will be, so it'll be a really nice finish. And there we go. What a beautiful finish. I love this for a decorative edge. It's very nice and clean finished edge. The only downside I would say is that it can be a little bit bulky inside, so you have to be careful with that if you have some heavy fabrics, but you could pick a really light fabric to do the binding. You don't have to pick the same fabric as your fashion fabric. So it's quite lovely, and it gives a really nice inside edge.
And seam finishes don't have to be fancy. Just pick one that accommodates your fabric, your time, and your tools. And I promise, once you start finishing your seams, you'll never go back, and your garments will thank you. And if you want to know what step comes after finishing your seams, check out this video here where I walk through the entire order of construction. And if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.